Welcome to the OShow. I'm Laura Babcock. I put out a post the other day that I was shocked at the rental rates, and I heard from hundreds of people in small towns and big cities about how out of control things are, how incredibly expensive it is, both for residents and for businesses to operate in this province. It's become a human rights crisis just to be able to afford to live in Ontario. It's madness. What's being done about it? Well, today we're going to hear from people who are renters who have gone through hell, and they will tell us their stories, and we'll talk to a former landlord. And we're also going to talk to some experts who are working on the situation in Hamilton and in Toronto to try to find solutions to this very, very big but urgent problem. It's going to be minus 25 at the end of the week. There are people, 1,600 alone in Hamilton, who are living on our streets who are homeless. And Hamilton is the third most expensive city in North America. We have got to start working together to save lives and to solve this housing crisis. Our first panel here on the OShow are people who are experiencing this rental crisis, this housing crisis in our community, both from a tenant perspective and also from a previous landlord perspective, which is so important in this conversation. They requested that they be a part of the OShow because they had a lot to say, and I think that's fantastic because I want to hear from their direct personal experiences. So I want to start first with Britt. Britt, welcome to the program. Tell us a little bit about yourself and why you felt compelled to want to speak about this publicly.
Thanks for having me. So I am busy. I am a full-time student and I work and I am the sole income for my family. We have 3 children, all with different varying disabilities. So my husband is a stay-at-home caregiver. The reason this is very close to my heart is we have been rent evicted twice. And we are currently in a home, which is, I mean, it's a decent size, but it's too small for my family. And we are paying much more than we ever did before. And we're also paying about 60% of our income in rent. This has always been a passion of mine. I've always been worried about the housing crisis in Hamilton, and just like the personal experiences that I've had with the LTB and the RTA have just, pushed me to be all the more active in this conversation.
Can you do me a favor, Britt?
Yeah.
There's so many acronyms. I'm not an expert on this topic, and just
Sorry.
I had about 500 emails and messages about this the last 2 days, and so many acronyms that I was losing my mind. What are these things?
So the LTB is the Landlord Tenant Board. They are the overseeing council that would make decisions whenever a landlord and tenant are in a disagreement and go to court. The RTA is the Residential Tenant Act. Okay. Rental Tenant Act or Residential Tenant Act. Sorry. And that is like, it's the act, it is the, overriding laws that pertain to rental properties in Ontario.
Okay.
Yeah. And so I have been in battle with a previous landlord with the LTB. Unfortunately, I apparently missed my meeting. Like I missed my date. I missed my court date, which was very frustrating because I definitely have been like, I was on top of it and I don't believe I ever actually received the date in writing. But so we ended up just kind of like, we lost, right? They showed up, we didn't. And so we didn't get anything out of it. But that was a landlord who, said they were going to move in themselves. They gave me the form, which was an N12, if anybody knows anything about the forms for the LTB, and said that they were going to be moving in. And then
Rob's got receipts.
Yeah. And then they listed it for sale the week after we moved out. So that was, like, we knew that you wanted to sell. Why didn't you just sell with us in it? It was a big, huge fight. I am a full-time student. Right now I'm about to graduate from the social service worker program at Mohawk, and I'm continuing on to get my bachelor's. And one of the main reasons I decided to continue on with my education is because my student loans are paying my rent. So I have to pay those back eventually, but right now we're in a home and my student loans are able to pay that so that I don't, that I can afford everything else that my family needs. So,
Britt, I honestly I can't imagine. I have two kids, and I remember paying off my student loans, but not in that situation where the student
mhm,
loans were paying for the rent, and I
yeah.
don't can't imagine the stress on your family, and to have and I've heard from a lot of people, and a story I keep hearing is that rent eviction based on the false premise of a family member moving in, and so the landlord has to boot you out. And I know one person reached out and said that they're watching a house for a year that they were kicked out of to make sure that the landlord lives up to what they said. So is that a particular kind of rent eviction notice if their family's moving in the N12? Because I've heard
And
that.
12, yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry that happened to you, and I want to go. So I'll circle back around to see what you think, having navigated this frustrating process and being in the situation you're in, what you think needs to change in the system. But thank you for sharing your story, Britt.
Yeah, no problem.
And no, and you know what? Even if they did let you know about the meeting, having three kids and going to school full time, I can imagine missing something. So, I mean,
Right.
it's frustrating you couldn't get that rescheduled.
Mhm.
Jesse, tell me a little bit about your comment to me on, I think it was Facebook, where you said that this has impacted all facets of your life for the last 5 years. I thought that sounds overwhelming and also fascinating to me. What did you mean by that?
In the 10 years, now 11 years since I've lived in Hamilton, I've lived in 10 different locations. It's exhausting and moving is exhausting. And I have been evicted, rent evicted, served the N12 the same as Brit has been. And that happened back in 2018. And then it's really honestly the thanks and gratefulness and gratitude to the community of people and friends I have here in Hamilton because none of my family live here. They all live a couple of hours north of here in Grey Bruce County. That I was able to stay in the city. Otherwise, I would have had to move back to my parents' house. So I lived in one basement of a family's house for a few years, and it was very cold down there. And now I'm living in a friend's house, and the friend bought the house with the thought of having an apartment for me to live in. So it's really, truly the generosity is that I'm that lucky. But I'm not the only one. So I've been evicted. I've lived in several locations. My partner, he's been rent evicted and he has to live with his parents right now because even despite working a full-time 40 hours a week job, he cannot afford rent in Hamilton right now. He can't afford a one-bedroom apartment. And one of my other friends, 75% of her income from her full-time job is going towards paying her rent. So this is just like every aspect of my personal life, my social life, seeing like people that I love and are close to me going through the same thing, and also like in the last few years, like we all sort of lived through and saw the tent crisis and people living in tents literally outside my house in my backyard, and just that sort of thing has just been so permeating every aspect of my existence. And looking on ads every day to see if I can find an affordable apartment for the people that I love, and you can't. And then and hearing all these stories, and I know other people who've also been evicted, and stories of bad landlords and people who don't care about their tenants or care about the spaces that their tenants are living in. So I kind of found your Facebook post to be a bit discouraging, Laura, because when I saw it, I just thought, this isn't news. This has been my life. And like, I'm glad you're all here. I'm glad you're all here finally, but it does feel if I was discouraged. But I'm glad we're having this conversation, and I'm glad that you've had such really strong feedback and that you're able to have such a wide and diverse group of people that are able to speak to this.
I haven't really understood the crisis on the rental market. I've understood lack of affordable housing in sort of in a broader sense, right? Like the market, there's not a lot of supply, and I've certainly done a lot of shows on the encampment issue. But what I think the missing piece was for me, and I'm so glad that you're calling me on it, is that if there is nothing available, and if you're spending more than the supposed 30% of your income on rent, like 60%, Britt said, you said 75%, your friend 75%, you are living in poverty. How can that not be poverty, right? And how long can that sustain before you end up needing to live in congregate settings or in encampments? Like, I think people disconnect the encampment crisis, and they often have a stigma and say, oh, it's only people who have mental health issues or people who didn't do this, that, or the other thing. No, I think it's a result of this impossible housing market. And we need to address it. So I'm glad we're here now. I apologize that we didn't sort of see this missing piece of the puzzle before. But I hope that we can raise awareness and make a dent. I mean, the city announced today they're going to put $4 million towards this, acknowledging, as they said it, it's a drop in the bucket. I mean, it's absolutely nothing compared to what the need seems to be, not only in Hamilton, but right across Ontario. Let me go to you, Rob, because you have lived in other municipalities. You've been both a landlord and you are a tenant. I think you got your N12 just this week, you were telling me.
2 days ago, literally.
Right. So you were the only landlord that I could get to do the show. I had people call me, text me, send me private messages, say they'd put things in writing, but they were terrified to come on camera, which I think is so sad, right? So sad that people, both renters, and I heard a renter who wanted to come on and said they were too afraid of their landlord taking retribution from doing the OShow. It breaks my freaking heart. So you're here, you have both perspectives. So, you have the floor, Rob. Tell us how you see this situation, this crisis.
First of all, obviously, I can relate to Britt and Jesse in their situation because I've been there. So this is my second N12 now that I'm dealing with. Well, actually, so what happened with me was during the pandemic, I went through a separation, and I was a homeowner with my ex, and I needed a place to stay. It was agreed upon that we would separate, and I got a condo downtown. Now, because I'm in the entertainment industry, we were completely shut down, as you know. So that owner of the condo was like, well, how is he going to pay his rent? And I get that. So he asked me to pay the year in advance, or else he was going to rent to somebody else. Now, I had the means to do that. Most people don't. Most people don't have 20 grand to write a check to do this. Luckily, I did, even though I'd lost, that's a whole different OShow, is But so a year later, again, he rents were going up. I'm not going to say what I was paying, but his son was supposedly moving in, which turned out to be his stepson, and he was also an Ontario Limited Corporation. You can't do that stuff legally. So luckily, I have friends who used to do the hearings at the LTB board in my community, and she took it upon herself to help me out and basically write the letters to the landlord saying, you're in the wrong, and we came to a settlement before it ever went to the LTB board. So he paid me out a good chunk of change, over 10K. We can't say exactly how much it was, but basically, I'm a lucky one because I have the connections that maybe some of the other people here on the panel didn't or don't, and that's what really, I'm one of the lucky ones because of that. Britt, these guys, they don't know where to turn. The LTB is fine. For this situation I'm in right now, currently, we're dealing with human rights violations. We're dealing with rental housing enforcement unit, which is REU, which is a completely different board. The LTB also now is involved. This is to a grander scale than the last one, but these current people I'm dealing with feel they're above the law. In fact, they've sent me emails saying that federal laws apply to rentals in Ontario, which they want to increase my rent by 10% in February 1st, which is tomorrow, which is again total. These people are into stuff that's completely illegal. So it's mind-boggling to me as a former landlord and having rented from legit real estate agents who are friends of mine, that these people really don't know the laws regarding rentals. I had a student rental housing place back in the 90s with my father. Even then, we would pay them the interest on their last month's rent at the end of the year, which is by law what you need to do. It's just I don't understand. And I was in a position like Jesse where I rented a house in Niagara to a friend of mine who sadly had cancer, and I gave her the sweetheart deal only because to help her out because she had lost her house, etc. So I've been on both sides of the fence. So it really, you'd use a different word, but I'll say ticks me off that these people when you have a perfectly fine tenant who's paying their rent on time, ahead of time, in my case, I could pay a year in advance, and they're still pulling these kind of stunts. It's maddening, you know. And in my case, luckily, again, I have her helping me out again with this situation. But we shouldn't be in this situation, and it's a vindictive eviction, because I called them out on stuff, you know, and that's that. And again, that's what happens. You call them out on my dishwasher hasn't worked since last summer. I moved in with the premise of air conditioning being here. It's never been hooked up. You know, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on, and the stuff is not being taken care of, and that's something that a landlord needs to do, you know.
So Rob, I mean, there's so many things.
I know it's
No, but it's huge. But we'll try to pick at it a little bit, and maybe I'll do multiple shows on this.
yeah.
But I just want to go out. Okay, so from a tenant's perspective, the heartbreaking these N12s. One of my kids has a friend from school whose family just got one of those, right? And the whole family is having to leave, and they can't, you know, I don't know if they can afford rent elsewhere, but it's very, very stressful. And so, I mean, it's happening all over. I've got friends who have kids who have moved back home because they had an ODSB claim and now they can't afford, they got rent evicted. I mean, I think it's touching all of us now, right? And in different ways. And so it seems on the side of the tenant, there's, if you complain, you get shortlisted maybe by some unscrupulous landlords. Up, they're next to go, right? You get these claims of family coming in. Sounds like some kind of a loophole that can be used to say I need to use the home. It doesn't seem like there's any enforcement of regulations, if the regulations even exist, which is maybe my next question. Like, are there protections for people? Are they being enforced? But on the landlord side, Rob, and I'll come back to you on this in a couple of minutes, but just to put in your mind, as a landlord, if you have a tenant who is not paying or is actually damaging the property or whatever, you know, can the landlord get assistance with fairly transitioning that tenant, or do they have to spend a ton to buy them out, or do they lose, in some cases, all of their contingency funds? And if landlords, and we'll come back to this, but if landlords are feeling disincentivized to even try to be landlords or be in the business because it seems so chaotic, how do we densify? You know, how do we put more affordable dwellings in these giant homes? Maybe people want to create another dwelling in their home to help with the housing shortage. But then they say, this sounds totally chaotic. I'm afraid it's going to make people not want to divide up their houses and provide some affordable housing options. So I'm concerned with kind of the big picture on what this chaos is leading to. So I'm going to leave you for a sec, Rob. I'll come back and ask you that question though. Like, why would landlords want to be landlords in this chaos? But let me go over to you, Jesse, because Rob was just referring to, you know, some empathy for the situation that you're in. You mentioned that you moved 10 times in 12 years since coming to Hamilton. Have they all been renovictions or gentrifications, or like what's causing that much turnover?
Some of it, like, yeah, so I was evicted once, and some of it was mostly gentrification based. Some of it was also my own personal decisions, moving into, an apartment with a partner or something, and finding out that that partner was, really financially and emotionally abusive, and then that costing me a lot of money and time to have to leave and change up my situation once again. And that was very difficult as well, because then, you know, I'm finding myself in situations with roommates or something, like whatever I can afford to get out. But then, you know, like one of those roommates was so violent, I had to call the police, like to have them removed. And, you know, like, so those kind of situations too, like it's rough out there. It's very difficult and then exhausting, because, you know, you're packing up your entire life once again and moving it. And then it kind of got to a point for a few years where I was almost afraid to unpack my stuff, because I thought, I'm going to have to move again soon. And this is honestly, this current situation is the first time where I felt safe to unpack. And because my landlord is also my very, very good friend. So like, in some ways, I do understand and have sympathy for landlords such as my friend, but then at the same time, I see and hear and have personally experienced those landlords that Robert is referencing, like who are trying to find loopholes, who don't actually take care of their tenants, and who do think that they're above the law. And it's a very scary situation when you're the tenant, because there is most definitely that power differential. No matter how you shape it, the landlord is the one who owns the space, who has the asset that you do not have. So that's very difficult. And then, but that's also hard because, like, currently in my space, like, my space is great, but it's only great for one person. So seeing my partner get evicted and be unable to find a space, but I don't want to move in with him because I don't want to give up what is a secure and affordable living situation in the middle of a crisis to live with somebody else with in a house with a landlord who could potentially be one of those people who, and just don't want to find myself having to once again pack up my life once again to do that, and then having had other negative situations in really bad relationships with really bad partners. I just don't want that to happen again, and it's not fair to inflict that upon my current partner, who is not like that. But then also, just because of this crisis, it's not possible for me to move.
Well, I'm sorry that you got abused, and that
Thank
absolutely
you.
sucks. And you brought up something a few years ago. I was working with women's shelters and a How's the Weather campaign, trying to put out the message that a lot of women are living in precarious housing for what you just described. They get into a living accommodation, their partner becomes abusive, and they really have nowhere to go, nothing they can afford. They end up couch surfing on friends' couches, sometimes for years, always with that go bag. It can lead to abuse. There's not enough room at the shelters. I mean, it breaks my heart listening. It's an incredibly serious problem in Hamilton. And the idea that you've had to live with a go bag, that this is the first time that you feel you can unpack. I mean, I know you guys are probably familiar with Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? If you don't have shelter as a basic need, you can't move on to those other levels of security and mental health and all that other stuff. I mean, the stress must be unbelievable. I want to go to you, Britt, listening to this. You've got 3 kids that you're dealing with, and you're finishing school, and I hope you get a terrific job coming out of when you finish. When do you finish your certificate or your degree?
I'll be done in April for my college certificate, and then I have two more years to go for my bachelor's as well.
Okay. Well, I hope anyone watching offers you a job right away as soon as
Thanks.
seriously.
I'd really love to be a housing advocate, guys. Just throwing that
Well,
out there.
you know what? We clearly need them. So, Britt, listening to the stories, what's your take on this conversation, and
Yeah.
what do you think we should be focusing the conversation on? I mean, I'll go back to Rob about sort of the landlord stuff, but what do you think listening to this?
Sure. I have so many thoughts twirling in my head, and I'm going to try and keep them concise. But as you said, like there is a big issue with the landlords that are taking advantage of their tenants, and the landlords that are not taking care of their property. And when you do complain, then all of a sudden you're getting an N12, right? And as you said, like with the enforcement piece, there is no enforcement unless the tenant actually goes to the board, and that can take months. It is a very long, drawn out process. This tenant who just got displaced from their home, who is dealing with that crisis, as well as whatever else is going on in their lives, dealing with the fact that they can't afford their rent at this new place, is now they are responsible for making sure that the landlord is held responsible. And so the onus of responsibility needs to be, somehow taken off of that tenant. Like, it should not only solely be on the tenant to make sure that they're held accountable. I believe that there definitely needs to be some oversight in, when there is an N12, there needs to be some sort of follow-up to make sure that they're actually following through with that, without the tenant having to camp and watch the house and see if it goes up for sale, or to see if they rent it to somebody else. And as Jesse said, with like, there is a very huge problem in Hamilton with abused women being displaced and being homeless. Our shelters are full. Like, there's no space, there's no beds, there's nothing. And I know the other thought that I wanted to make comment on was, you talked about having landlords split their homes, which is definitely a part of a solution in order to include more affordable housing. But I feel like one of the bigger problems in Hamilton that I've seen is that there are families, large families, who are stuck in small apartments, which those small apartments would be great for a single person, right? And so there's no full homes available for families to rent, which therefore means they're taking the apartments, which then means the single people are on the streets, right? So it's a cascade effect. And I feel like our problem cannot be solved solely with having landlords making their dwellings into duplexes, which is all there is. Like if you go on to find a house for rent right now, you can't. It is all duplexes. It's, you know, basement's a separate apartment, or you get just the second floor, or whatever the case may be. And in my case, when as I said, I have 3 boys. 2 of them are autistic. One of them has ADHD, and one of my autistic sons is very loud. Like he is a loud person. The last time we lived in a dwelling that shared walls with somebody, they ended up setting a fire in their house to try and smoke us out, because my son was bouncing at 3 p.m. in the afternoon on his small little trampoline that he had. We had to have the fire department come out. The police came out. They got a restraining order. She was arrested because she ended up hitting the cop, you know, like, so we had to make that decision. We were like, we cannot share a space with somebody else ever again. We need a full house, because we can't have people living below us that are just, you know, they have a right to reasonable enjoyment, but also we have a right to not have to, you know, literally hold my child down so that he's not bugging the people around us. Right. So yeah, that's just my take on, you know, the affordable housing that's available in Hamilton is not the right type of affordable housing that needs to be available. There are many buildings that are sitting empty because they just need renovations. They don't need renovations.
Renovating without the evil intent.
Right. Yeah, they just need some renovations, and in order to be accessible to people, you know, and I know like with this bill 23 and with the sprawl and trying to make more, you know, luxury homes and luxury condos, it's not helping. There isn't, in no way is that a viable solution to help our housing crisis in Hamilton.
Well, you'll get no argument from me there. The whole ploy that says that we need housing, therefore we'll break a promise, lie, rip up the green belts, hurt the future sustainability in farmland and the environment for future generations so we can build McMansions.
Yeah.
I'm not a fan of Doug Ford and his BS.
Right.
And it's certainly not going to do anything to help with this situation. But I want to touch on the multiple family dwelling thing for a moment. Yeah. And I have a child with ADHD, and I completely understand. In my home, we make a lot of noise, you know, all of us. I can't imagine being smoked out by a neighbor because, you
literally,
know,
I couldn't, she literally like set the fire, and her excuse was she wanted to smoke us out. Like
absolutely disgusting.
Horrific.
Yeah, horrific. And I'm sorry your family went through that. And there is a housing list, as we know, 8,000 families long in Hamilton for affordable housing. One of the big needs are these multiple family dwellings, because we have a lot of families that are coming into our city. We need, of course, the newcomers to join our community. Often larger families. We need more than just these ideas of these basement apartments for one person. Like what you were saying, Jesse, you've got this good place now, but it's only for one person. So do you bring your partner in or not? Like, what do you do, right? You don't want to lose the good place. And I've heard from so many people, Rob, who have said that they are putting up with a whole lot of restrictions, limitations on their lives, fear of their landlords. I mean, I've lived in communal dwellings all through university and when I was single years ago, where I might not be getting along with one of my roommates, and that's stressful. But to have an actual legal fight going on with your landlord, who's like going up and down the stairs outside, like I would be sick with stress about the level of conflict that would bring to my family. So I mean, there are, I think people look at it as a numbers game. There's this many apartments, there's this many. If you listen to, you know, some former counselors who lost terribly this election, say, oh, well, you know, we've got a lot of them coming down the pipeline. Yeah, that is not meeting the reality of families in Hamilton who are being smoked out by their neighbors or threatened by their landlords. There is an apartment building in Hamilton that hasn't had running water for a month. A month. What the hell is the mayor and the city doing about that? I don't understand why this is supposed to be priority number one. Where is the outrage? Where is the urgency? Okay, enough with my rant. Rob.
And I'm glad you want to be an advocate, Britt, because my friend Andrea, who is helping me out, I've told her you could do this full time, but because she's also had these situations happen to her, honestly is sick to her stomach to do it, and she can't do it full time because it just honestly ticks her off so much.
It definitely ticks me off a lot too, but I feel like that just fuels my power to like continue the fight.
So I hope you do what she can't do, because like people like you know, Jesse and even myself need people like you who want to advocate, because even in my case, as being a former landlord, the rules have changed a lot. For example, Laura, if you rent a basement apartment, for example, as of 2018, if you have not, if that apartment has not been rented out before 2018, there are no rent controls on that apartment.
No, there is not.
So technically, they could raise my rent 10%, which is what they want to do. But my apartment has been rented out constantly, which I have proof of. So yeah,
It sounds like you have to be freaking lawyers to rent in Hamilton.
Yes,
Yeah, you have
absolutely.
to know, you have to very much know your rights.
You do.
Like that thing about the security deposit, when did that change? Because I think I always gave them when I was a renter back in the day. Has that always been the case? Like I'm
it's
sitting here,
always been the case. Yeah, you cannot ask for.
I ignorantly paid that, right? And so I'm listening and I'm thinking to our audience watching, you're all busy, you're all busting it just to make ends meet.
Yeah.
And you have to also do deep dives into changing legislation, and there aren't enough advocates out there. And when you try to get help, you're waiting for months and you miss your thing and you lose. I mean, so I gotta ask, like, this will be sort of the final round, and I'll pose some of your comments to the next panel. But like, if there were a couple things, and I'll start with you maybe on this one, Britt, because it sounds like you're going to do this for a career. But if there were a couple things that you would see as being immediately necessary, like if the politicians watching this, and I know there are many, if they were able to see this and say, oh, I did not realize that those couple of things have to happen before all these other things, right? There's stuff around Airbnb and there's stuff, a couple of $1 million here, but like, do these things now, what would they be?
So to touch on Rob's point with the 2018 and on builds, I believe that needs to change immediately. The new builds having no rent control is absolutely atrocious. And I know many people have moved into homes not realizing that they were new builds. And then after, you know, a few months, 1 year, whatever the lease is, they're like, oh, we're going to raise the rent $1,500. So that needs to change 100%. The other thing that I would say needs to change immediately is licensing. What other business can you be in where you do not have to hold a business license? Why are landlords not responsible? Like, why do landlords not need to have a business license in order to rent out their homes? I believe that would have that would add a lot of oversight into the economy. And I believe that that's something that needs to change immediately. And what was my other thing? There was one more.
If you think of it, you can
I'll throw it out there. Yeah.
But you reminded me, a friend of mine just moved from Hamilton to Toronto, had been living in the in-laws basement, got a job in Toronto, got a condo, has been in it for a little while, and then found out the rent's going up $700 a month with so now they have to move, right? And they're like, so, I mean, I know this extends beyond Hamilton. I was just, when I put out a tweet or a post about a 2-bedroom being like $2,300 on average and a single being like $1,900, I was out of my mind thinking, how do you possibly pay that? How much money do you have to make a year to make that 30% of your income? Then have a credit rating to prove that you're a good renter? I mean, I could have never passed any of those bars trying to get an apartment back in the day. So it's bananas, but I hear what you're saying. You know, you got to get a business license if you want to have a business. I think that makes a lot of sense. And the idea, I want to go to you for your suggestions on this, Jesse. But I heard from one guy, Sean Dowling, who watches the show a lot, and he said, there is no sort of, it's all analog. All these things are conversations and disputes, and there doesn't seem to be like a digital database. Like when I pay my business taxes, I got to go online. My bookkeeper's got to do everything exactly right. Like, where it sounds like it's the Wild West with the rental market. People can charge what they want. Everything's a verbal dispute. I mean, I feel like there should be some of that systemization, maybe. Sorry, go ahead, Britt. You wanted to add?
No, I was just sorry. That was emphatic agreement. That was the other thing too, was just the fact, like with the rental prices between tenants, when these rent evictions happen, the reason they're happening so often is because then the landlord can charge whatever they want for rent again, right? So if there was something in the act that stipulated that when a tenant leaves and a new tenant's coming in, you can only raise it a certain amount, then that would minimize the amount of rent evictions drastic.
We have Mohammed from the Hamilton Legal Clinic who's joining us on the next panel, and I'm going to pose some of these questions about that incremental. Why isn't it incremental? These things, but also people have brought up to me about municipal taxes and about people having townhomes and paying single-family dwellings and like all kinds of shenanigans seem to be going on, which I'll ask Mohammed about on the next panel as our lawyer. Let me go to you, Jesse. What are the urgent, immediate, hello, wake up, please get on this that you would want our audience to hear today?
I absolutely agree with everything that Britt has said and Rob has said. Especially having removing rent controls. That's like when I heard that happened, I was like terrified because we are seeing this happening, and there aren't a lot of resources. So a lot of the information and knowledge I get about my rights as a tenant comes from groups on Facebook or Reddit, honestly, and just talking to other people. I also think that there's a lot of problems here. I think it's a problem of greed that's happening in our country right now, where we're seeing corporate tax rates in Ontario is like 2% and 15% for federal, and that's insane that it feels like we're in this world where the rich keep on getting richer and the poor keep on getting poorer, and I don't know who are these magical people that are going to be affording all of these McMansions that we're tearing apart the greenbelt to build. I don't now know who they are. Where are they coming from? Because we're building all these structures that really only benefit the people at the top, then there's no space for us. And I don't know I'm not an expert here, but I don't know why we don't have more accountability for those groups and more accountability for landlords, so that tenants are protected and tenants do have rights in these situations. Because it is really exhausting. When you were talking about all this stuff, it took me about 6 months to afford to leave that abusive partner. I had to save up money and get an extra job and do this all without my abusive partner's knowledge, until I was ready to pull the plug. So when we're talking about domestic violence and those sort of situations, I think about that a lot. And then I also just sort of when we were also talking, when you mentioned Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and if people are just concerned with just surviving, just the bare minimum, that you don't have any mental energy or time to think about anything beyond that, let alone fight the power differential that you are in order to secure your rights as a tenant to something as basic and as essential as a home. I don't know if this is the biggest answer, but I would say more social housing needs to happen. They're right, $4 million is a drop in the bucket, but if we tax corporations, then maybe we would have more than $4 million to spend on housing. I don't know.
No, you're right. There's a widening
You're right.
gap between the rich and the poor, right? We are seeing the dissolution of the middle class, and and I agree with you on a federal level, they should be looking at taxation. They should be looking at profiteering in the pandemic. There's all kinds of things that are crushing down. But just when I think about, Britt, your family of 60% going to rent, what do you eat? Food prices are through the roof. The Toronto Food Bank usage went up 400% from last year, right? 400%. If I had 40% of my money left for everything, transportation, utilities, everything else, I would use a food bank if I had to. I mean, it's not as though it's just about, a tenant and a landlord having a dispute. It's about a lack of choice. And when you don't have choice, right? If you don't have choice to leave an abusive partner, if you don't have choice to find a safe place for your family to live, where you don't have somebody trying to harm your family to get rid of you, I mean, it's no way to live, right? And I don't know that the powers that be understand that this is just not about market supply and demand. This is a human rights crisis that you're describing to me.
Housing is a human right.
The powers that be are part of the 1%. I'm sorry.
Right. Well, and I think it's incumbent, Rob, and I don't want to put you on the spot. It seems to me that, like you were saying, you were able to be a landlord at one point and you've got a decent place now. But I think it's incumbent on people who aren't spending 24 hours of their day looking for food and shelter and how to get to the next step and pay the next rent bill to, whether they're self-actualized at the top of the pyramid of Maslow or not, to get involved and to realize that this is happening all around them. There's a humanitarian crisis in basement apartments and in our encampments in Hamilton and across this province, and I don't see signs of it getting better. So Rob, what do you think from your dual perspective here? And you seem to have you sent me an entire dossier of files. You are one of those people who gets it and is working on it and has the time or the connections to deal with it. What needs to be done to help people who are just trying to live and get their education and feed their families?
Again, Laura, it's tough because like I was saying, I mean, I have the means to right now and at this point in my life to take care of myself, but I've been to the couch surfing point in the past. I've been there. I'm also bipolar, so I get it. I've been on ODSP in the past. I actually have a lifetime. If I wanted to go back on it, I could go back on it any day if I wanted to. But
isn't the rental allowance on ODSP like $600 or something? Like
the ODSP hasn't changed since I was on it, and I think last time I would have used it was in like 2012, and I honestly I don't think it's gone up a penny since then.
It has not.
It has not.
It hasn't gone up. It hasn't gone up at all. I want to say it's been 15 years, 14 years.
What's the rate of
is
it?
what it is right now, whereas like the average one bedroom is about $1,700 a month or $1,800.
And what is the ODSP allowance?
A single person on ODSP in total, their total check is $968
for everything, but rental loan is $1,700.
Right.
So where does one live?
That's even lower than it was because I was back in the day.
That's a good question, Laura.
What it was just over 1,000. So wow. Like again, so I empathize with everybody because I don't need it, even though I qualify for it technically, but I'm in that situation, but I've been in the other people's shoes. And it's not a fun place to be. Trust me.
So what can we do, Rob? Like if you had like one or two asks, and I'll certainly bring this to our next panel where we have, as I mentioned, some experts and people working on this professionally.
Like we're with Andrea, the girl that's helping me out. We're at my wit's end. I mean, we talked about licensing. Again, I have my smart serve. I worked in the bars. I've never served a drink in my life, but I have it because bar owners wanted me to get it because even as an entertainer, they wanted me to have that. So again, we talked about licensing, even a day-long course online, something that at least will give landlords an idea. They got to pay $50. I don't know, whatever, just to educate them as to some of the basic rules as to what they need to do to provide a standard lease form, for example, not the 400 rental agreement form that most people will get. That's not a legal rental form. It means nothing. It's just a piece of paper to agree to rent. A standard lease form is what you actually should be getting. And again, most tenants have no clue about this stuff. Even I didn't, to be honest, when I rented the condo, I had no clue. So even in my position, because I hadn't been a renter other than from friends of mine at their houses in an official position where you need to provide credit check, et cetera, et cetera. Even I have no clue. So I've learned a lot in the last couple of years.
I got to ask, okay, so if the OShow wasn't doing this today, Jesse, to your point, like, and I've had some other people going, it's about freaking time, Laura, that you're doing this. If we weren't doing this today as like a volunteer YouTube show, where would you go? Is there like a central resource that says tenants, here are all your rights, landlords, here are all your rights, everybody, let's...
So I would just like to suggest, obviously my first suggestion is to read the Residential Tenant Act, right? But it's very full of legal mumbo jumbo that's really hard to understand sometimes. There is a group on Facebook, which I have utilized quite a bit. It is called Ontario Tenant Rights. It is a volunteer. It is run by volunteers, and they are extremely helpful when you're having any sort of issue with the landlord. And like there are landlords in the group as well, so that they can understand the tenants' rights as well, right? Which I think is really important, is the fact that like the landlords need to know the rules too. And many of them don't even know the rules, right? So, but that's definitely one of my biggest suggestions to anybody watching this is like, if you know a tenant, make sure they know their rights, definitely look it up.
I'm in that group. It's very useful.
It is.
I will put that group up when we're editing the show to get it out there, and I'll tell people I know who I alluded to earlier are going through all this stuff, because you're not empowered if you're not informed. You're easily taken advantage of, and when we know supply and demand, there are going to be people who are going to try to profiteer off of this crisis. So we want as many people informed as possible. You were going to say something, Rob? I'm sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah, I was just going to follow on Britt that I used that group actually before I found out my friend was an expert in this field. And there's also, I do have the email. I don't have it off the top of my head, but there is, at the time when I was going through this, when I received an N11 actually, which is a whole different form. That's a fun one where they try and persuade you to move out and try to fool you.
Sorry, an N12 is if their family is coming in, they get to boot you, and an N11 is they try to persuade you to leave.
An N11 is a legal agreement between a tenant and a landlord to end the tenancy. Right. Landlords often use them as basically to trick people into signing it. And so if the tenant signs it, they have signed that they will be ending the tenancy, and they therefore no longer have any rights to the tribunal.
Exactly. It's beyond really trickery, to be honest. And this is where I started this is where we're at now because of my original N11 form, which is my original landlord sent me at the condo. And I'm like, what is this? I go, an agreement to, and then, so that's where it all started. But there is, so that I looked into it. There is a legal department. I'll look up the emails, because I do have the emails, and they will, if you provide them your N11 or N12, they can provide some legal assistance for free. It's located in Hamilton. Off the top of my head, I don't know their name, but I'll find it.
I'll certainly ask our next panel, the lawyer from the Hamilton Legal Clinic, and
I believe that's actually who it is.
I was going to ask if it was the Hamilton Legal.
I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah.
And I will just let our viewers know, I did reach out to Acorn to see if they wanted to join the discussion, and to Hamilton Co-Housing. I didn't hear back from them in time for the program, but hopefully in future, because this conversation is very, very broad, of course. But can I ask all of you to come back another time to dig into this more?
I would love to. Yeah. Happy to.
So, gentlemen, as I told our last panel of renters and a landlord, I'm not going to be able to get to all the issues on this OShow special today, and you probably won't have all the answers to their suggestions or to the situation, but I want to sort of start with where you're coming at this from, sort of your high-level assessment of the crisis, and a little bit about what you're working on, and then we can get to some of the other issues and specifics that were raised. So if I can, Aaron, let me start with you. First time on the OShow and coming from Toronto. What was your interest in being a part of this discussion today, and what is the organization that you're working with trying to achieve?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I'm with the Better Way Alliance, and we are a group of business owners that advocate for things like higher minimum wages, paid sick days, stable scheduling, because it's not just good for us morally, it's good for business when you come down to it. So we just recently released 2 reports. One is our business case for ethical employment, highlighting all those things. The other is our commercial rent crisis report. We're seeing an acceleration of increased rents across Ontario, especially in urban areas like Toronto. I just came from Mississauga, where we were meeting with a business owner whose rent had gone up 300% over the course of 2 months. So it's totally legal. There are no regulations whatsoever when it comes to commercial rent. So we've put forward 3 easy to understand policy ideas, really light touch regulations, standardized leases, a commercial tenant board to resolve disputes, and a cap on large scale rent increases for commercial tenants. The reason we took this on is we're all about creating good local jobs with benefits for our employees. When most of our revenue is going to pay some big company an investment or an REIT, it's harder for us to actually pay people properly and invest in our employees, leading to higher turnover and a depressed economic area.
It affects businesses, it affects people, and it has this kind of ripple effect. And I want to go to you, Tom, because I see you nodding emphatically. When I touched off my little tweet about the rental costs in Hamilton, I heard about like 60 different issues connected to that, including, the one we heard heartbreakingly in the first panel about not being able to leave an abusive relationship because of nowhere else to rent, right? Or not being able to complain about a bad landlord for fear of rent eviction. I mean, there's so many impacts to this. So can you tell me from your perspective of having worked on this for so long, what is the state of the housing crisis, and what are some of the impacts that people really need to understand before we get into, some of the solutions we have to start advocating for?
Well, Laura, it is an absolute crisis. There's no other way to put it. Hamiltonians who are renting are facing unimaginable pressures right now, and you've heard about them. And it's not like we didn't know it was coming. For the last 10, 20 years, housing advocates, affordable housing advocates have been urging, begging governments to invest more in affordable housing, to change legislation so tenants aren't under the foot of greedy landlords. And yet there hasn't been enough political action to resolve the crisis that we're now facing. Hamilton is now the third most expensive city in all of North America to live in. We've seen more and more reports showing that rents are skyrocketing, and it's becoming impossible for people on fixed incomes, particularly those living in the deepest poverty on provincial social assistance programs, to afford any level of rental accommodation in this community. Rates have been frozen for Ontario Works recipients, and they did go up a little bit for Ontario Disability Support, but it's still below inflation. And we've seen those rents continue to climb and climb and climb. And there's no end in sight. And so we need governments at all levels to step up and implement radical reforms to change this situation.
So the announcement by Hamilton Council today that they're putting, I think, $4 million towards the problem and 50 units, which someone said to me, drop in the bucket. And also, are any of those units multi-dwelling units for families who are desperate to find a place to live? I mean, it's a start, but I think we can all agree is not the radical reforms that you're referencing, Tom, which
No,
we'll get
absolutely not. We need something along the lines of what Canada did following World War II, when there were returning veterans and there wasn't any place to house them. Canada made massive, massive investments in affordable housing. And that's where we see a lot of, we call it wartime housing, but that's where we see a lot of new builds taking place. And we need that sort of thinking. We need that type of massive infusion to ensure that people have a place to live. Housing is a basic human right. People need a place, a foundation, a roof over their head. I'm sure Mo could probably talk about all of the huge challenges in Ontario's rental housing legislation, but certainly we also, while we need to protect tenants absolutely from being evicted, we also need to generate that massive infusion of new units so people have some place to live.
Yeah, excellent points. Our first house was actually one of those wartime houses on the escarpment, and I'm not even going to say what we paid when we got it because it just seems so grossly unfair to what people would be charged. We couldn't have entered today's housing market, not with our. I mean, it's just absolutely inaccessible, let alone the rental market, which is obscene. It's obscene and this is where I want to go to you, Mo, because you tweeted to me, you kind of broke it down for me about, what the cost of rent is, what people make, what people who are on some of these programs have in terms of a rental allowance. I mean, and just even having the upfront proof of income to what's being charged. I mean, I don't even know how I would even dream of getting an apartment, let alone getting into housing. So, Mo, how do people cope? Like, how are they dealing with what seems to me to be a very frightening situation?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I actually, it's hard for me to actually conceptualize how people are coping because I don't know what it feels like to be in that level of desperation. As I tweeted, OW shelter allowance is at $395, ODSP shelter allowance is at $495. It's essentially, and with the cost of rent, it's essentially like it's legislated poverty and it's legislated exploitation. It's a combination of those two things in benefit of people who are ultra rich, and people are being pushed further and further into the margins, and people are then, as a result, becoming more and more, we're seeing more and more homeless folks popping up all over the country. It's an impossible situation that when people come to us, we don't have an answer. Our office is a band-aid solution to a monumental problem that needs desperate intervention from all levels of government. So city council, I think they're doing the best that they probably maybe can. They could do more, definitely, but their hands are tied, because really what we need is massive investments. I think maybe 4 years ago, the entire National Housing Strategy budget was something like 0.4% of the entire federal budget. So we're not seeing the money that is really required to address this level of desperation that we're seeing out in the community.
Well, when Trudeau was in Hamilton last week, I tweeted him to look outside the window, or anywhere, and see the level of absolute poverty in our community, and to do more with the National Housing Strategy. Because I think, Tom, we celebrated when the National Housing Strategy finally came to be, right? And we were excited when the basic income pilot came up, and then unfortunately, sadly, was canceled. But I mean, one of the things that frustrates me is when one government level says, well, we can't do anything because of the other. It's their responsibility. National housing's theirs, and the provincial stuff is theirs, and the local stuff is theirs. It's a single taxpayer. We are all Canadians. We are all in Ontario, and we need to have our governments have that urgency. So let me just go to you, Tom. Like, when I hear Mo talk about, or when you talk about that wartime housing, like, why aren't we doing that? Because certainly ripping up the green belt to put in McMansions has nothing to do with solving problems of the panelists we just heard from. Like, it is so far away from what this province needs that it's almost obscene. So help me understand, how do you approach the multi-level of governments without letting them pass the buck on this? Like, how do we zero in to get what we need?
Yeah, and it does take political will, and you're absolutely right, Laura. We need to be building up, not out, and it's not acceptable. And we have to, as voters, as residents of our communities, not make it acceptable to kick the can down the road and accept these, interjurisdictional squabbles. We've seen the cost in human lives, and more people are dying on our streets, and more people are experiencing homelessness here in Hamilton than have ever in the past. We have, last count, 1,600 people here in Hamilton who are living rough. And that's not acceptable by any definition of a just society. So yeah, we have to, make our voices heard, demand action and investment from the federal and provincial governments, and yes, the municipal government too, to ensure that the mistakes we've made over the last 20 years aren't repeated, and we need to get that housing built.
Aaron, I heard a stat that the food bank usage in Toronto went up 400% last year. 400%. And as you'll hear from our panel that was just on, some of them are spending 60% of their income on just rent, right? So I'm like, how are you feeding yourselves? Because after utilities and transportation and everything else it takes to live in modern society, where's the money left for food? So I want to ask you, from your perspective, you have an organization that has put together reports, that is obviously, creating an impetus for some sort of legislative action on this. How do you approach this and say, this is what it will take to get the kind of legislation or standards in place to protect these commercial tenants from these outrageous rates? Like, tell us what you think the way forward is.
I think one of the biggest misconceptions about food bank use is that it's just poor people. It's just these homeless people using it. It's everyone from almost every strata of income that's starting to use food banks, from the statistics that I've seen. So this isn't just impacting, the people you might pass on the street whose clothes are a little rough. It's everybody. It's my employees. It's your employees. So we're looking at this from the perspective of, like, health is wealth. If we don't have a healthy society, we can't have healthy businesses, and that I think is really the crux of this issue here. We're seeing massive rent increases on both sides of the board, residential and commercial. And where are these, like, where is this money going to? And especially on the commercial side, it's going to big businesses. That doesn't create a healthy or fair market for anybody. And that reduces, once again, my capability to pay my employees what I want to pay them and to make sure they don't have to go use a food bank. So we're really at a point now where if we don't regulate, and I'm saying this as the leader of a business group, if we don't regulate
Right.
and create a fair market for everybody, then we're going to keep receding back into feudalism, where the average business person like me with 10, 15 employees is going to have to continue making difficult choices. And if our employees can't afford food, they also can't afford to come to work in a city like Toronto or a city like Hamilton, which I know that your Chamber of Commerce has been studying lately about the transit issues in the city and how it's impacting the labor force. So there really is a need for a holistic solution on this, and it comes from all three levels of government. So that's why we're advocating primarily with the province right now, and we're seeing them we're gaining a little bit of traction there because we're also seeing this impact the trades and apprentices. Apprentices, you start out 18, 20, 22 bucks an hour. If you can't live on that, well, you're using the food bank. And if your employer because the rent has gone up, can only afford to bring on one apprentice instead of 2 or 3 like they normally would have, well, that impacts the whole apprenticeship program that the Ontario government is really pushing right now. So they have a desire to be invested in this, because if they don't, then we're certainly going to see less and less people that are able to live in the areas that we need them to live in.
You know, it's brilliant listening to you. And I'm so glad you're here, because I used to be the executive director of the Oakville Chamber of Commerce. And you know, business organizations have a certain reach with certain governments, right? Whereas some other, you know, community organizations may not have a reach depending on which government is in power. What I love about this conversation, Aaron, is that you're working with the provincial government in a business organization capacity, making the argument for, you know, the economy functioning and businesses being able to be successful if this issue around out of control rents is being addressed. And I think having you at that table saying those things, when we can also have people who are advocating for tenants' rights and for the rents of tenants, you know, non-commercial residential tenants, it sounds like it might be much more powerful, right? If we're all speaking together, if we're all addressing this, if this is not, you know, some kind of ideological issue, this is an absolute crisis that is affecting the ability of Ontarians to live a good quality of life. And I want to go to you, Mo, on this, because we heard, you know, there's a legislative kind of solution here, but you said that your organization, the Legal Clinic, is but a Band-Aid solution, that there's so much wrong or lacking from the current legislation and standardization around rents and rent increases. I just want to ask you about one particular instance from our last panel, which blew my mind. Apparently, if your place that you're renting didn't have tenants prior to 2018, you can charge whatever rent you want at whatever kind of intervals you want, that there's no reining that in. So you can try to boot tenants out every year and jump at 20% if you feel like. I mean, is that correct?
Yeah, so it's a little bit more nuanced than that. So there are carved out exemptions that happen after November 15th, 2018. So units that came to be after November 25th, 2018, or were previously never occupied or were never used for residential units. Yeah, they are free of rent control, which is something that the current government did at the start of their term, and along with a couple of other decisions. In terms of tenant protections, we've seen the Landlord and Tenant Board, which is generally a place where tenants can seek refuge in terms of asserting their tenant rights, has been watered down, has moved to a digital-only format. We're seeing even the legal clinics themselves in 2018 were also defunded, were cut by 30%. That money never came back into legal aid. We're seeing this dwindling of rights. We're seeing these dwindling of rent control that actually, to be honest, began before the Ford government. It's been happening since the Mike Harris government. It's been happening where we've moved towards this ideology of housing as a revenue stream rather than housing as a human right. And the thing about housing is that it cuts along all lines. The legal clinic is partisan. Housing affects every single person. I can put aside my own values as an abolitionist to understand that housing is required for every single person on this planet. And I think we've lost our way in that. And, that particular legislative choice that was made in 2018 to take away rent control, and their idea behind it was that, well, it's actually going to incentivize more buildings to be built. It did the opposite thing. It actually didn't make people build more homes. Instead, it just said, it carved out a space for people, and it's a space for the system that we're in, which is capitalism, to continue raising the rent to infinite amounts until they accumulate as much wealth as they possibly can. We've lost our way in terms of how we imagine housing from the time of wartime to what we are now, where housing now, if you look at it, even the way that people buy homes now, they're not seeing it as a place to rest as number one in your hierarchy of needs. It's seen as a revenue stream, and we've lost it. And that piece of legislation actually is indicative of that.
So I want to just break the wall for a second, Aaron. I know I said a half an hour, and we are coming up to that. If anyone has a hard out, I completely can edit around that, or I just want to do one more round again for about another 5 minutes. Is that cool? Okay. So, well, obviously, gentlemen, there's a whole lot of layers to this, and I'm, as I said, blown away that the commercial tenant movement there might be something that the residential tenant organizations working on this can work together on to make the case that we need rent controls. But beyond rent controls, if I could just hear from you each one more time, and I hopefully will have you back again. What do you think are the most urgent priorities for whichever government right now to focus on? What are you pushing for? What should our audience say? I need to get on this. I need to understand this. Here's where we need to put our energy. Let me just start with you, Tom.
Yeah, so this might not surprise you, Laura, but I'd say certainly we need to find alternatives for people who are currently living rough on the streets. Even if there were massive investments in affordable housing today, it would take time to get those units built. And with those 1,600 people experiencing absolute homelessness, we need solutions. And shelters don't work for everybody. And that's why we've been pushing for the idea of a tiny cabin community in Hamilton. And unfortunately, that idea has been kicked down the road again by City Council for another 4 months while they continue to look and study the idea, despite the fact that the HATS group, the Hamilton Alliance for Tiny Shelters, has presented to Council 9 times in 2022 and 2023 already. We've provided multiple reports. We think this is needed now. It's going to be minus 25 degrees on Friday. It's going to be the coldest day we've had in 3 years. And there's people outside in it. It's completely unacceptable. We need action, and we need it now.
And Don Seymour, who was on the panel about this with you a few months ago, wrote a hell of an op-ed in the Hamilton Spectator. Everyone should check out about it. It really is obscene what is happening with HATS. So thanks for bringing that up, Tom. So I hear what you're saying. We need that affordable housing stock inventory built as an urgent priority, but let's not forget there are people who are at risk of dying right now while we're waiting for governments to get their act together. Aaron, what would you say is sort of the number one ask that you've got on the table of the province, or you think that people need to be focusing on?
It's a good question. And I think it's hard to pin down to just one thing. What I want to see is more cross-partisan partnerships happening. There's so much that goes to governments, and this is for all 3 levels. And I know municipal isn't necessarily partisan, but it kind of is. I think all 3 levels of government need to work together more, put aside their political differences, because we are entering an era in Canada where governments aren't necessarily working the way that they were intended to when we formed this system. So we all need to reimagine how we can get creative about these solutions and how we can all work together on them. I can talk commercial rent all day long is our most severe issue facing retail and manufacturing businesses in industrial parks. But unless there's a political will from across the spectrum to fix these things, we won't see it fixed. Like I said before, health is wealth. Without a healthy society at all levels, our country can't grow wealthy itself. And I think that's what we're all out here for, is the betterment of Canada and to make sure that everybody has what they need. We can only do that if everyone's working together.
Well said. And Mo, what do you see, either from your legal framework or just from, your perspective, as being the ask, the need for the politicians who are watching the OShow? What is it that we need them to be doing?
I think I would want to hone in on two things immediately. One would be tighter rent controls, and closing the loophole on so that we can have vacancy control. I think that will, at least in the immediacy, at least tighten down what we're seeing in terms of rents exploding. The other thing is what we saw over the pandemic and the continuing pandemic that is possible is reinstating UBI. I think that would have an immediate impact on some of our most vulnerable individuals.
Sorry, what was that?
And
Your acronym? Sorry, Bill?
Universal basic income, and not just 2,000, but I believe it should be at this point up to 2,500 a month. I think that's something that is possible. We've seen is possible and can be done quite quickly and would alleviate a lot of issues, whether in housing or food precarity, or even just like the ability to contribute into our economy.
Well, all excellent suggestions and all doable, right? If we work together. And I want to take, just as a last comment, your mention, Tom, about, voters, right? And where I sit here after hearing the heartbreaking stories from our previous panel today, and all of your suggestions, what you're working on. We just had the municipal election. We just had the provincial election, and the federal election's a ways off, right? So we cannot wait for another election when people are on our streets dying, when you hear the heartbreaking stories of mothers with families that can't find a place to live, abused women who can't leave their apartments because there's nowhere else to go, when you hear about how precarious the housing market is for your neighbors, and we hear about businesses that cannot employ, that cannot provide the kind of wages they want to, and the impact that will have on the broader economy if we don't get this rent crisis and these out of control rents under control. So thank you all. Let's keep working together. Hopefully I can have you all back on this. We certainly can't unpack it in one show, but I wanted to hear what you're working on and to give people a sense of hope that we see the problem and we're going to start working together even more effectively on it. Thank you all so much for being a part of the OShow. Please subscribe on YouTube so you don't miss any of these panels that we come up with. And this won't be our last discussion on the housing crisis in Ontario, I can tell you that.